Steam filled the bathroom, like a thick curtain, separating it from the outside world. The warm water flowed over Maeve's skin, washing away the burdens of the past days. This was her ritual, a rare moment of peace that she cherished after the divorce. Morning showers had become her small sanctuaries, where she could finally focus on herself, on her thoughts. Her fingers slid through her hair, forming foam from the shampoo, when an unusual sound reached her ears. At first, she dismissed it as the noise of the water or perhaps the wind playing in the shutters, but a moment later she heard a barely audible sigh. Maeve froze. The warm water continued to flow, but her attention was riveted to the frosted glass door of the shower cabin. Behind the steamed-up glass, a silhouette appeared. Her heart began to beat faster. She slowly reached for the towel hanging outside the cabin, but at that moment, a voice sounded. "Mom?" The voice was husky, trembling. She recognized it immediately. It was Caleb, her son. "Caleb!" Her voice sounded sharp, almost breaking. "Sorry, I thought I heard your phone ringing." His words came quickly, as if he was trying to justify himself. She grabbed the towel and swiftly opened the shower door. Cold air rushed into the room, making her skin shiver. Wrapping herself in the towel, she turned to her son. Caleb stood motionless, as if rooted to the spot. His shoulders were tense, his hands hidden in the pockets of his sweatpants. His gaze flickered. He would lower his eyes to the floor, then briefly raise them, only to look away again. "What are you doing here?" Maeve's voice had demanding notes, but inside she felt more embarrassment than anger. Caleb stepped back, but still avoided looking her in the eye. "I heard something, thought it might be important. And you decided to just walk in." Her tone was sharper than she intended. "I'm sorry, I didn't. He trailed off, his face flushed, and he looked like he wanted to disappear into the ground. Maeve took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. "Next time, knock, okay?" she said more gently. Caleb nodded but still did not meet her gaze. He slowly turned toward the door, but before he could leave, his eyes lingered on her for a split second. There was something in that look that she couldn't quite decipher, something between surprise and concern. When the door closed, Maeve stood alone. The air in the bathroom was still filled with steam, but she felt that the warmth of the water no longer soothed her. Her heart was pounding, and her mind was racing with thoughts. "It's just a misunderstanding," she told herself. But inside, everything tightened. The boundary between them, invisible and unbreakable until that moment, suddenly seemed not so strong. The rest of the day passed in a tense, strange silence. Maeve tried to distract herself with household chores, but her thoughts kept returning to the morning. She noticed that Caleb didn't come down for lunch. Usually, he never missed a meal, especially if the kitchen smelled of his favorite dishes. She tried to convince herself that it was all nonsense. "It doesn't mean anything," she repeated to herself. But every time she passed his room, she felt a strange tension in the air, as if his presence was tangible even behind the closed door. When evening came, Maeve decided she needed to ease the tension. She prepared his favorite pasta and poured herself a glass of wine. Picking up a tray with a plate, she approached his room door and knocked. "Caleb?" There was a slight movement behind the door. "Yeah? Aren't you hungry?" "Number?" Her eyebrows furrowed. This was so unlike him. She slightly opened the door and peeked inside. Caleb was sitting on the edge of the bed, his laptop beside him, the screen dark. He looked like he was still pondering the morning incident. "I brought you some food," she said, placing the tray on his desk. "Thanks," he muttered, but his voice sounded distant, almost indifferent. Maeve paused at the door, trying to read his expression. "Are you sure you're okay?" she asked cautiously, her voice gentle, almost soothing. "Yeah, it was just weird this morning," he replied, still avoiding her gaze. Her heart ached. She wanted to reassure him, but she couldn't find the right words. "I don't want you to feel uncomfortable," she said after a brief pause. "It was just a mistake." Caleb looked up, and there was something in his expression that caught her off guard. "I know," he said. "It's just, you've changed." Her breath caught. "Changed? What do you mean?" He hesitated, as if choosing his words. "You look different. Happier, maybe." Her gaze softened as it shifted to him, and she felt a strange warmth spread across her chest. Maybe I'm just trying to figure myself out, she admitted. He nodded, but his gaze, lingering on her, was longer than usual. When she left the room, the tension still hung in the air. Maeve couldn't shake the feeling that something between them had changed. It wasn't just an awkward moment. It was the beginning of something bigger, something incomprehensible and unsettling. Late at night, lying in her bed and staring into the darkness, she realized that the morning episode still haunted her. The boundary that had once seemed absolute now felt as thin as a sheet of paper, ready to tear at any moment. The next morning seemed ordinary on the surface, but for Maeve, everything felt different. The house, which had always been her fortress, was now permeated with something intangible. It wasn't fear or anxiety, but rather a lingering sense of Caleb's presence everywhere, in every corner, in every sound. It seemed that his glances, caught unawares the day before, still hung in the air like unfinished conversations. In the kitchen, she prepared breakfast, trying to distract herself. Eggs sizzled in the pan, and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the room. She expected Caleb to come down as usual, but the hours ticked by, and his footsteps didn't sound. A slight disappointment mixed with relief. She wasn't ready to face his eyes again, which yesterday had seemed so unfamiliar, and yet eerily familiar. When the clock struck 9, she decided to go upstairs. With a tray in her hands, holding a plate of omelet and a cup of coffee, she knocked on his room door. "Caleb?" Her voice sounded gentle, almost soothing. After a few seconds, a response came. "Come in." She opened the door and found him at his laptop. The screen was on, but his gaze was distant, his fingers motionless on the keyboard. He looked like he was trying to do something, but couldn't find the will to focus. "I thought you might be hungry," she said, placing the tray on the table. "Thanks," he muttered, glancing at her briefly. She didn't leave immediately. Instead, she lingered, looking at him. Caleb looked tired, his shoulders slightly hunched, his eyes red as if he hadn't slept. "Are you really okay?" she asked, her voice filled with genuine concern. "Yeah," he replied quickly, but his tone was too sharp to be convincing. Maeve sat on the edge of his bed, folding her hands in her lap. "Caleb, if something's wrong, you can tell me." He looked up at her, and there was something strange in his expression. It wasn't embarrassment or anger, but something she couldn't define. "I'm fine, really," he said. Her eyes lingered on his face. "Is it because of yesterday?" she finally asked. Caleb froze. His hands involuntarily clenched into fists, but he quickly relaxed, as if trying not to reveal his emotions. "I don't know," he said softly. Silence hung in the room, so thick it seemed tangible. Maeve felt that there was an invisible line between them, which both were afraid to cross, but were drawn to nonetheless. "It was just an awkward moment," she continued, trying to sound calm. "Such things happen." "Yeah," he agreed quickly. "An awkward moment." But there was something in his tone that told her otherwise. It wasn't just awkwardness. He looked at her in a way he never had before. His gaze lingered too long, too intently. Maeve stood up, trying to ease the tension. "You know where to find me if you want to talk," she said, heading for the door. But before she could leave, he said, "Mom?" She stopped, turning to him. "Yeah? You've changed." Those words caught her off guard. "Changed?" He nodded, avoiding her gaze. "You look happier, more alive." "I don't know. Just something's different." Her heart raced. She hadn't expected that from him. Those words were simple, but there was something in them that struck a chord with her. "Maybe it's because I'm trying to think more about myself," she admitted. "After the divorce, I realized I'd been living for others for too long." He looked at her, and there was something new in his eyes, something she couldn't name. "That's good," he said softly. Maeve nodded, feeling the strange tension between them intensify again. "Okay," she replied. "I'll leave you to eat." She left, but her thoughts remained with him. His words, his gaze, his manner of speaking. It was all strange and confusing. In the evening, when the house was enveloped in silence, Maeve sat in the living room, sipping a glass of wine. The fireplace glowed with a soft, soothing light, but her thoughts were far away. She didn't hear Caleb come down. His voice sounded unexpectedly. You look good tonight." She looked up and saw him standing in the doorway. His face was tense, but there was something more in his gaze. "Thanks," she said, feeling her voice tremble. Caleb came closer, sitting next to her. There was enough space between them to feel comfortable, but the distance seemed both too great and too small. "Are you sure you're okay?" he asked. Her heart tightened. His concern was genuine, but there was something else behind it. "Yeah, of course," she replied, but her voice was softer than she intended. Caleb looked at her, his gaze lingering on her face longer than usual. "You're just different," he said again. Maeve felt her cheeks flush. "Maybe that's not so bad," she replied, trying to lighten the tension. But Caleb didn't smile. His gaze was serious, full of emotions she couldn't decipher. "It's not bad," he said finally. "It's beautiful." Her heart raced faster, but she forced herself to look away, to avoid meeting his eyes. "We both need time to get used to the changes," she said, trying to sound calm. "Maybe," he agreed. But the tension between them didn't dissipate. It hung in the air, heavy and uncomfortable, like a cloud that wouldn't let them breathe. Maeve felt her heart stop. She knew this conversation was just the beginning, that from now on everything would become more complicated, and the answers to the questions they were afraid to ask would be even more tangled. The house was shrouded in nighttime silence, but Maeve couldn't sleep. Her thoughts raced like a leaf torn from a tree in the wind. The way Caleb had looked at her that evening still haunted her. His words, his glances. It all left her in a state of turmoil, making her feel something she couldn't name. She was a mother. That was her role. But now with each new moment, she began to feel that role shifting, losing its clear shape. She sat in the living room with a glass of wine, gazing at the flickering fire in the fireplace. The light from the flames danced on the walls, creating an illusion of movement in the empty room. Yet she didn't feel alone. On the contrary, she knew Caleb was still awake. She could feel his presence, even with his bedroom door closed upstairs. She heard his footsteps before he appeared, soft, cautious, as if he didn't want to disturb the silence. When he entered the room, Maeve turned her head and met his gaze. He looked serious, but there was something warm in his eyes, something strangely intimate. "You're not sleeping," he said, more stating than asking. "Neither are you," she replied with a slight smile, trying to lighten the atmosphere. He shrugged and sat down next to her, closer than usual, so close that she could feel the warmth of his body. "I just can't sleep," he said softly. Silence filled the space between them again, heavy with unspoken words. She looked at him out of the corner of her eye, noticing how he nervously fidgeted with the edge of his shirt. It was so unlike him, the confident and independent young man. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, trying to fill the void. Caleb hesitated. His gaze lingered on her face, then slid to the crackling flames. "About a lot of things," he said, evading specifics. "About you." Her heart skipped a beat. Those words were so simple, but there was something in them that made her chest tighten. She felt her fingers grip the wine glass tighter. "About what exactly?" she asked, her voice gentle but with a note of wariness. He sighed and turned to her, his eyes meeting hers. She couldn't look away. His face was serious, and in his eyes she saw something deep, something she had never seen before. "You've changed," he said again, repeating the words he had told her that morning. "But it's not just external. You've become different, and it's amazing." Her breath quickened. She wanted to say something, but the words stuck in her throat. She felt his gaze penetrating her, reading her thoughts, seeing her as she didn't want to be seen. "Caleb," she began, but he interrupted her. "No, listen to me," he said, his voice firmer. "I know this sounds strange, maybe wrong, but I can't stop thinking about you. About how you look at me, how you smile. It's not just a habit, it's something more." Maeve felt her heart pounding as if it wanted to escape her chest. She looked up at him, and her gaze met his. She saw honesty in his eyes, raw and unguarded, that made her feel both exposed and desired. "Caleb, you can't talk like that," she said, but her voice trembled. She felt her inner world crumbling. Everything she knew, everything she believed in, seemed to suddenly lose its meaning. He leaned closer, his knee touching hers. She should have moved away, set clear boundaries, but instead she froze. His face was so close that she could feel the warmth of his breath. "Why?" he asked, his voice soft, almost a whisper. "Why can't I? This is the truth. This is what I feel. And I think you feel it too." She should have objected, but instead she remained silent. His words were too honest, too accurate. She felt it too, but this was wrong. They couldn't do this. They couldn't continue. Caleb reached out, gently touching her cheek. Her skin burned from that simple gesture. She closed her eyes, trying to find the strength to stop him, but she couldn't. Instead, she allowed herself to feel, allowed herself to be vulnerable. "Tell me to stop," he whispered. His voice was trembling, but full of determination. "If you want me to stop, just say so." She opened her eyes and looked at him. In that moment, the world disappeared. There was only them. She saw him as someone more than just her son, someone who saw her as she truly was. "Caleb." Her voice was soft, almost pleading, but she couldn't find the strength to say the word that would stop it all. And in the next moment, he leaned in, his lips brushing against hers. It was soft, gentle, like a whisper. Her mind screamed that this was wrong, that she had to stop it, but her body, her heart, her soul, everything told her otherwise. The kiss deepened, and she felt all her defenses crumbling. She was a woman, not just a mother, and in that moment, she allowed herself to feel it. Maeve woke up earlier than usual. The first rays of the morning sun filtered through the half-open curtains, casting intricate shadows on the walls. She felt her heart pounding, as if reminding her that last night had been real, that it had happened, that she had crossed a line she never intended to cross. Her gaze slid around the room, but everything remained in its place, as if nothing had changed. Only her inner world was different, shaken, disrupted. She remembered his lips, soft and insistent, and how her heart was torn between the desire to stop and the inability to do so. She remembered his hands, still uncertain, as if afraid of being rejected, sliding over her skin, leaving trails of warmth that she still felt. It was wrong, but it was so real. Caleb was sitting in the kitchen when she finally came downstairs. He was already dressed, a simple t-shirt and jeans, his hair tousled, a cup of coffee in his hands. He wasn't looking at her, but she felt that he knew she was there. Maeve stopped in the doorway, gathering her thoughts. Her body tensed, as if preparing to dive into icy water. She needed to say something, do something to fix what had happened, but the words stuck in her throat. Caleb looked up, meeting her gaze. His face was serious, but there was a shadow of concern in his eyes. "Good morning," he said. His voice was steady but slightly trembling. "Good morning," she replied, her voice softer than usual. She entered the kitchen, trying to act as if everything was normal. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down at the table across from him. The silence between them was deafening, filled with unspoken words. "We need to talk," she finally said, not looking up. Caleb set his cup down on the table and leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "I know," he said softly. "But first, I want you to know, I don't regret it." Those words made her look up. In his eyes, there was so much determination that her heart skipped a beat. "Caleb," she began, but he interrupted her. "No, let me say this." His voice was firmer. "I know this is wrong. I know what you're thinking about what will happen next, and I'm thinking about it too. But I can't deny what I feel. You've changed. I look at you, and you're more than just my mom. You're something more to me." Her breath quickened. Those words, so honest and open, made her feel exposed. She should have stopped this, set things right, but she couldn't. His words resonated with her soul. "Caleb, Her voice broke, but she forced herself to continue. "I can't say that I don't feel it. I do too. But this is wrong. We can't do this. We can't continue." His gaze darkened and he sighed, as if trying to accept her words but unable to. Why? He asked. Why is this wrong? Who decides what's right and what's not? We're not hurting anyone. This is just between us. Maeve felt her heart ache. She wanted to agree with him, but she knew reality wasn't that simple. It's not just between us, Caleb, she replied. Everything has consequences. If someone finds out, if this gets out. He leaned forward, his voice softer but firmer. No one will find out if we don't want them to. Those words were both comforting and frightening. She knew he was telling the truth, but it didn't ease her feelings. She knew this couldn't continue, but every word he said, every look, made it harder. The rest of the day passed in tense, strange silence. They avoided each other, as if trying to give each other space to think. But every movement, every sound in the house reminded Maeve of what had happened, and of what she couldn't ignore. In the evening, she heard a knock at her bedroom door. She knew it was Caleb even before he spoke. "Can I come in?" His voice was soft, almost pleading. She hesitated, then nodded, as if he could see her. He entered and closed the door behind him. His face was serious, but there was something soft in his eyes, something she couldn't ignore. "I need you to understand," he began. "I don't want you to feel guilty. I don't want you to think I'm forcing you into anything. Everything that happened, it was because I feel it. And I think you do too." Her heart tightened. She wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, but she knew it would be a lie. "Caleb, this isn't so simple," she said, her voice filled with pain. "We have roles to play. You're my son. I'm your mother. That's what defines us." "That's not the only thing that defines us," he countered, taking a step forward. "We're more than that. You're more than just my mother, and I'm more than your son." Those words hit her like a lightning strike. She felt tears welling up in her eyes. "I don't know what to do," she admitted. Her voice trembled, and she felt her defenses crumbling. He came closer, carefully taking her hands in his. "Then let's figure it out together," he said gently, step by step, without pressure, without fear. She looked at him, and in his eyes she saw such sincerity that her heart skipped a beat. She nodded, knowing her decision wasn't right, but unable to stop it. The night was strangely quiet. Maeve lay in bed, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time she closed her eyes, Caleb's image appeared, his intent gaze, his careful but insistent touches, his words echoing in her mind. "You're more than just my mother, and I'm more than your son." She thought she could control it, that last night would remain in the past, but she was wrong. Something had broken, something had changed, and she couldn't make herself pretend it hadn't happened. The next day, they avoided each other. Caleb didn't leave his room, and Maeve pretended to be busy with chores. She walked around the house, tried to read a book, watched TV, but nothing could distract her from her own thoughts. Every sound in the house made her jump. Every movement reminded her of Caleb, that he was nearby, and that something heavy hung between them. But when evening came, everything changed. She was sitting on the couch in the living room, staring into space. In her hands was a glass of wine, but she hadn't taken a sip. Suddenly, she heard footsteps. She knew who it was. Caleb entered the room, and the air grew tense. He looked concerned, but there was something else in his gaze. Determination. "We can't go on like this," he said finally. She slowly turned to look at him. "I know," she replied softly. "Then tell me, what should we do?" His voice trembled, but he tried to hold himself together. "You're avoiding me. I can't take it." She sighed heavily, setting the glass down on the table. "This is wrong, Caleb. We both know it." "But it's also true," he countered, taking a step forward. "Why should what we feel be wrong if it's so real?" She looked away, feeling tears welling up in her throat. "Because that's not how the world works," she said. "Because if someone finds out." He knelt down in front of her, his hands carefully taking hers. "But no one will find out. This is just between us." Her heart raced. "Caleb," she whispered, but he interrupted her. "You want me to stop?" "Tell me to." She opened her mouth, but the words didn't come. He traced his fingers gently over her wrist, and a shiver ran through her body at his touch. "You can't say it," he said softly. She closed her eyes, feeling her breath become uneven. I'm scared, she admitted. Caleb gently touched her chin, making her look at him. I am too, he said, but I'm not afraid of what others might think. I'm afraid of losing this if we pretend nothing happened. She looked into his eyes and there was no doubt, no fear, only truth. We can't just pretend, he continued. We need to figure out what to do with this. Together. She felt her resistance melting. Caleb. She whispered his name, but he already knew her answer. Between them there were no more boundaries. They had crossed them, and there was no turning back. The house was enveloped in a deep, breath-holding silence. The world outside its walls continued to exist. People went to work. Cars sped down the roads. The wind rustled the leaves of the trees. But for both of them, that world seemed distant, unreal. They were trapped in their own universe, within which there were no more boundaries. Maeve sat on the edge of the bed, her body tense, as if a string stretched to its limit. Caleb stood by the window, looking out into the night, not daring to turn around. We can't just forget. He broke the silence, his voice soft but firm. She knew he was right. They had crossed a line, and now there was no going back. She couldn't look at him the same way she had before. He was more than just her son. There was something more in him. She ran her palms over her face, trying to gather her thoughts. And now what? She asked, her voice barely audible. Caleb turned around and looked at her. His gaze was full of determination, but there was also uncertainty in it. Now we live with it, he said. Her breath caught. Live with it. She repeated his words as if trying to understand their meaning. He sat down next to her, carefully taking her hand in his. Yes, he said. We don't need to give this a name. We don't need to try to understand what's right and what's not. We just feel it. She looked at their intertwined fingers, at how her hand lay in his, and felt a strange peace. But we can't, she began, but couldn't finish the sentence. Why? He asked, his voice gentle but challenging. She looked up and met his gaze. Because it will destroy us, Caleb. He leaned closer, their faces just inches apart. Maybe, he agreed, or maybe it will make us stronger. She closed her eyes. I don't know. He traced his fingers gently over her cheek, and she felt a shiver run through her body. Then don't think, he whispered. Just be here, with me. She slowly inhaled and opened her eyes. I'm scared, she admitted. I am too, he replied. Silence filled the room again, so thick it seemed tangible. They sat side by side, feeling each other's warmth, realizing that this moment had changed everything. And perhaps it was inevitable. Maeve didn't know where this path would lead. She didn't know how long they could keep this a secret. But in that moment, in that silence, she decided not to think about the future. She would just feel.